Hi, and welcome, everybody. It's good to have you all here. I'm Stephen Holmes. I teach at the law school, and I'm a co-director of the Reese Center on Law and Security, and our patron saint, Rick Reese, is right there, whose moral support, we appreciate so much. It's a nonpartisan, interdisciplinary research center focused on strategic questions that are shaping and reshaping our national security environment, which is why we're so thrilled to have Calder Walton here with us today. He's a historian, an author, historian, and at one time barrister. So he's kind of fits into our environment in some way. And we're going to discuss his new book, which I hope you all buy it. It's a very, very good book, a very long book, which is worthwhile, very worthwhile reading. I just finished it. Spies, the Epic Intelligence War Between East and West. Really, East and West, it's US and UK against Russia, basically, is what it is. With a final chapter, fascinating, on China. He's at the Kennedy School, and he's got these two programs he directs. The one that interests me and I want to talk about most is applied history. There's to intelligence. How do we apply what a historian learns? Because in a way, history is valuable in itself, giving us just perspective, but you're, I think, trying to focus on what we can get out of it. He has other accolades, which I could repeat, but I want to get into the discussion, really. It's going to last just an hour. We're going to end it 2 sharp. I'm going to talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and we'll have some questions, and we'll see how enlivened you are and interested you are in asking your own questions. The book is such a sweeping panorama. There's so many things in it. We could spend weeks discussing Cuban Missile Crisis or the Cambridge Five or Putin's intelligence failures and so on. But I think, well, at least my idea would be to focus on some generalizations. And the first one is this. You mentioned that the clandestine services, even though they're a very important part of our government, are not really studied in political science departments, in the universities. Universities, it's a kind of, you have a word for it there. You say it's a sideshow. You say it's a sideshow, even though, of course, it has a huge role in popular culture. And this is very true in law schools, too. We teach our students about every of the 3 branches of government and administrative agencies and the Environmental Protection Agency. But certainly the clandestine services don't get the attention that they should have given their importance. Why?
Great question. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to be here and for what I hope I'm sure will be a good Q&A session. So, why is there this missing dimension of intelligence and intelligence agencies, both in the academic literature and then in university campuses? You mentioned political science, but let me just say I think political science is doing a little bit better than my colleagues in the history departments, where it is literally intelligence often appears as a footnote. Why is that? I think for a long time, the legitimate excuse, if you like, was a lack of documentation. That certainly is no longer the case. There's now so many records. I mean, just focusing on the countries that I study in this book, the British, the US, and predominantly Soviet Union, Russia, there's now so many records that it's actually difficult to know where to start. So that doesn't really work. I think that there's, at least in the UK, there is, I'm afraid, the James Bond effect, which is to say, well, this isn't really sensible. This isn't serious. This is stuff that we see in the movies. This is sort of, spies doing cool spy stuff. And by the way, the subject does involve spies doing cool spy stuff, but often at key points, that can have a direct impact on international relations. So I've been doing this now, on and off for 20 years, and I still don't really have a good reason of why it is neglected. I think it's getting better, at least in the UK. There are more centers doing intelligence studies and intelligence history. You guys are doing well here. But yes, I'll say my own efforts to get it incorporated into the Kennedy School curriculum haven't got there yet, but I'm not giving up. But it's a curious thing of you can go to some of the best schools of public policy in this country, and you can graduate from them with a really not meaningful understanding of intelligence agencies, what they do, and then equally importantly, what they don't do, the uses and abuses of intelligence. So I think that, as we know, that another layer is that universities are, university campuses, departments are guided by the research interests of the academics, of the professors, and if I think that has a trickle
Yeah, but that's a
effect.
circle. Why aren't they interested?
I
given
don't have a good. But the strange thing is, I mean, just as a sort of anecdote, at the Kennedy School we run a study group, an intelligence study group, not for credit. People just want to come along and learn about intelligence. 10 weeks long. Do some history, do some practitioner stuff. This is a sort of 101 on Intel. We limit it just for a discussion group to 20 people. Each semester, we have between 60 and 70 people trying to get in. So if there are any university administrators listening, this is there's a huge demand there.
That's good.
Yeah.
I mean, could it have something to do with the fact that, I mean, you work very well with documents that are quite old. That is, the real information doesn't come out for a while. So therefore, contemporary, if you're trying to study contemporary politics, it's obvious, we know that from the past, that our clandestine agencies are doing things that are important that we should know about, but it's hard to study them. So I think this.
So certainly you're on firmer ground with the historical aspects from 100 years ago or even longer. Certainly, writing this book, what I experienced is that the archival records dry up the closer you get. In the UK, there's about a 30-year rule. And then I began to combine interviewing people. And that's not without its difficulties. And I think, another layer of your question is about interviewing and research
Tell us.
methodology with interviews. I certainly benefited from my legal career in interviewing people because I learned that the answers you get depends on the questions you put.
Good.
I think that as a historian, coming out of one of the world's best universities at Cambridge, I wasn't equipped well to do interviews. So I think that that's where my legal training really came in. So yes, the archival references dry up the closer you get, and then it's necessary to work from good investigative journalists, from leaks, but that's not without its difficulties because there might be agendas there on people leaking, and then interviews. And I try to triangulate my interviews. There was one story that got a lot of media attention about a Russian plan to late-stage planning to assassinate a defector on US soil in 2020, 2021. Originally I had one source for that, and I didn't feel confident enough to make this serious claim without another source. And then I got the second source and felt confident enough to include it in my UK edition of the book. The UK edition of the book came out after the US edition, and then that story was then confirmed by the New York Times. So that was quite a moment for me.
It's kind of a coup. Okay, so you talk a lot about, so you say that there are lessons to be learned from UK and US intelligence services during the Cold War that we can apply to China. So lessons, applied history.
Yeah.
So you talk a lot about pathologies, that is confirmation bias, continuity bias, wishful thinking, tunnel vision. What else do we have here? Well, paranoia, that's a very important one. You say the only difference between counterintelligence and paranoia is an index card.
Right.
So these are kind of universal biases that affect everyone, even historians.
Yeah,
Have confirmation biases and so on. But they're probably exacerbated by secrecy.
Yeah.
So one question would be, if you look across the whole period you're studying, under what conditions are these worse, and under what conditions do we handle them better? And I have one particular bias that I'd like you to address, and that is what you call loyal or patriotic intelligence. Where intelligence services, sycophantic, as you call it, adjust their intelligence to what the authorities want to hear. Now, we have a lot of examples of that. George Tenet, obviously Putin in the war, probably in this Israeli case. There may be something like that going on. We don't know. But are there institutions which manage this better, that manage to avoid patriotic, loyal, twisted intelligence that aren't really challenging the leader, because that's what we want. We want challenging intelligence. So, what do you think?
Well, on a sort of overall scorecard, I would say that the U.S. intelligence community has done well. I mean, as with anything, when you're marking, I think you need to mark it against the different
You should be a professor.
people,
You're giving grades.
people in the class, right? So the bottom of the class are definitely the intelligence communities of authoritarian states, as you mentioned. Some absolutely.
George Tenet didn't come from an
Well, no,
authoritarian state, but okay.
that's true. But I think what I was getting at with that is in an authoritarian state, it's almost inevitable that there will be sycophantic reporting when the situation is that telling a leader that invariably he or she is wrong could be literally a life-shortening experience. That was true with Stalin before the Nazi invasion of Barbarossa. And that was also going on, it seems to me, with Putin before the invasion of Ukraine. There was this Russian National Security Council meeting that we all saw on the eve of the invasion. And we all now know that it was pre-recorded because they had different times on their watches that it was showing. Anyway, Putin, as we remember, humiliated his director of foreign intelligence, the SVR, Sergei Naryshkin, essentially saying, no, hang on, we haven't got to that point yet. You've gone off script. We'll get there. And so he was tongue-tied and looked like a buffoon in front of the world's media. And then, by the way, they kept that in the recording. So what was going on there? Yeah. Did the SVR actually perhaps try to give Putin a more sober assessment of the chances of success of a Russian invasion in Ukraine? We don't know. We'll only know that through a defector or some.
Oh, I see. You think Naryshkin may have given him...
It could well be that's what led to the humiliation. There was clearly something going on between Putin, who regards himself as his own, in the Stalinist tradition, his own chief intelligence analyst, and there was a falling out clearly with Naryshkin.
Yes.
But to your point, there are other examples in liberal democracies of where loyal intelligence is provided, and you mentioned Tenet and all of that story that we all know about, of course. But I think I would see those as the exception of where there was a breakdown of intelligence, of an abuse of intelligence, rather than the norm. And I would say that in an authoritarian state, that system of essentially terror at times inculcates a situation that it's really, as I said, almost inevitable, if that's or inevitable, inevitable that intelligence will be warped to give the leader what he or she, invariably he, wants to hear. You look like you don't agree with that.
No. It's almost like secret intelligence is an oxymoron. I mean, there's something wrong with it, because when people aren't watched and aren't forced to give justifications in public, they start doing things which you probably wouldn't do if you had to do that. And therefore, there's a way in which these institutions, the
bureaucracy,
what someone would call the deep state, can do this. So how about another example? So Moynihan, in the book on secrecy, which is a great book, in his description of the Bay of Pigs story, because you discuss it, but this aspect you don't discuss, which is he says that these clandestine agencies tend to overvalue information that's secret, just because it's secret. And this relates to your plaidoyer for open sources. So basically, the open sources said there's not going to be a rebellion, but the secret sources says there will be, and they said, well, we're the only ones who know this. So that must be right.
The guardians of the secrets. But we've got all sorts of vested interests here. But then also it's on the recipients, on the customers, as they call them now, on the decision makers. Well, hang on, if you get a piece of paper that says top secret on the top, that's got to be the real crown jewels, hasn't it? And so it's very seductive for policymakers. And this is what I think is so exciting about the moment that we're all living through right now, with the development of open source or commercially available intelligence. that it's a game changer for that traditional methodologies of secrecy. And it's forcing intelligence agencies, both sides of the Atlantic, to really almost sort of existential crisis for them to answer the question, well, where's the margin? What are you actually producing that I can't get through incredible New York Times reporting, or Bellingcat, if you don't know Bellingcat, doing some extraordinary reporting on Russian malign activities overseas. So if you're the customer decision maker now, and you've got all of this different types of reporting coming to you, suddenly you're in a position to say to the CIA or to MI6 or whoever, excuse me, like why didn't you do this a couple weeks ago? Why was I reading about it on Bellingcat?
It's out there. On this top secret, I had a friend of mine work for German intelligence, and he said you go into the rooms with all this information, and you couldn't find anything unless it was called top secret. Then you could get your hands on it right away.
That's right.
It's more available.
That's right. It's a sort of, you end up in a Le Carré novel quite quickly, and you
Sounds
certainly within the files that I've been spending more time than I care to admit looking at. Well, actually, in fairness, in some of the historical files, the dossiers on people, you see how they blend genuine clandestine collection, telephone taps on targets, microphones inserted in buildings, and so on. With press reporting, with
Sure.
yeah. So it's
Like at Mar-a-Lago, they were all mixed up, Yeah. Okay. So
we're going there yet? Oh,
No,
I
no.
thought we were going to go there at the end of the hour.
No,
Okay.
we won't.
Yeah.
We'll never go there. So you talk a lot. I mean, one of the other kind of pathologies is more bureaucratic. You have these competing agencies. You have a labyrinth of agencies. Even if the collection is doesn't have an agenda behind it, and you can actually get it to the decision makers, you have to go through this labyrinth.
Yeah.
And one of the issues is that each of the different national security agencies, let's just be crude about it and talk about CIA, FBI, DOD.
Yeah.
And the national security environment in which we exist, the country exists, or us and the Brits exist, is complicated. Mm-hmm. And you need to be able to rank threats by gravity and urgency somehow.
Yeah.
But each bureaucracy, which has a personality, tends to accentuate the threat to which they have the best answer.
Right.
So, if it's DOD, the only answer to this threat is military force and so on. You can see the answer.
Yeah.
So one solution, which isn't a solution, but I'd like to hear how you think about it, is to try to find an agency, call it the National Security Council, that's supposed to look at this national security environment, try to decide which are the gravest and most urgent threats and so on. But it has to be, they can't have an operational job, because if they have an operational job, they will tend to do this hammer and nail logic. But on the other hand, that agency doesn't really have the information. The agencies that really know what's happening are the active agencies. So there's a paradox there.
There is an absolute paradox there. I mean, the National Security Advisor is supposed to be that honest broker to weigh up the different competing agency in the US context anyway. And now the UK has got a National Security Advisor as well. For exactly that reason. One of the things that I found difficult researching this book is that using the declassified President's Daily Briefs, which were the flagship CIA product given to different presidents.
When are they available? How long?
They're available up to the late 60s, early 70s. And although you can find discrete PDB briefings in later archives, but they don't contain covert action. And so they're often reporting on events in a specific country, which, by the way, the CIA is actually doing its best to influence. But you wouldn't know that by reading the PDB. So then that begs the question: how does the president or the small number of people in the executive branch, what do they know about that? Oh, well, then there's a separate meeting or a little quiet conversation of, by the way, this code word, top secret intelligence, covert action that we're involved with in this country isn't actually reported in the PDB. but that you should be aware that that's going on. So it's directly to your point of there's different layers and there's different competing people, and then there's different people who guard the really secret material.
Yeah, sure.
And that
And sometimes they hide it from the whole idea of the president, what is it called, the presidential approval process.
Yeah.
That they get around it. In the end, I think in the church commission, or committee,
Yep.
they've discovered that the president only knew about 10% of the covert actions that were happening.
And then the declassified presidential findings, which is to authorize a covert action, the ones that I've seen are very skillfully, loyally drafted, very broad as well, to instigate support for rebels within X regime. Well, what does instigate mean? And what does support mean? It doesn't get down to the granular level. I'm told reliably that the closer to our own, more recently, they do get more specific. But certainly historically, they were artfully drafted to be in the eye of the beholder. For exactly that reason, bureaucracies like to, they have vested interests. And if you draft a presidential finding to instigate a covert action that is suitably broad, you can say that you fulfilled what you set out to do.
Right.
That's probably the bit too cynical, but I think that's yeah.
No, you can't be too cynical talking about this subject. Okay, so one of the things I really liked about your book is you show another paradox, which I think is the right way to look at the history of intelligence, which is that in some cases, it's important that countries spy on each other so they know what each other is doing. And the information comes up, and then I'm not going to panic because I don't think Iran is going to attack or whatever.
Yeah.
On the other hand, because collection and information is so spotty and maybe half-truths, maybe just a dot, or you get the wrong dot, you can actually cause a panic too.
Yeah.
So you say both things, which I think is correct. That is, it's a classic, I think it's Harold Macmillan, whoever said this, we avoid Armageddon because we spy on each other.
Yeah.
Now okay, so tell me about that, because I think that's a very interesting.
Well, all states spy.
Two-side.
That's right. So all states spy, and it's been going on forever. But at some points in the scope of this book, actually not all allies spy on allies. So the absolutely extraordinary moment occurred during the Second World War when the Soviet Union became allied with the UK and the US overnight with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And the British Foreign Office, in all of its majesty, said, from now on, we are allies with the Soviet Union. They imposed an embargo on all British intelligence collection on the Soviet Union. Why did they do that? Because allies don't spy on allies. So this was this gentlemanly belief that this was how international relations worked. Absolutely to be applauded and honorable and totally and utterly naive in my view. So that was a striking example of when the UK, was it for moral reason, ethical reasons, or was it for a lack of resources? That fighting the war against Nazi Germany, did they actually have the resources to continue to collect intelligence on the Soviet Union at that point? We don't know where if it was for the good gentlemanly kind of restraint or for practical purposes, probably a combination of the two. But what is clear, obviously, as we know, is that Stalin, the Soviet intelligence services, showed no such gentlemanly restraint and actually achieved some of their most successful wartime intelligence successes, not against their enemies, but against the Western allies.
You mean the bomb, basically?
The bomb is what I'm really thinking of, yeah. So if there had been, to your point, if there had been more spying on allies by the British and by the Americans during the Second World War, my belief is that many of the problems experienced in the post-war years would have been less acute.
Okay, so tell the audience about you make an argument about the Venona, hiding the Venona decrypts, also from Truman, but in its effect on the society.
Yeah. So the Venona decrypts, for those who don't know, were a series of wartime Soviet communications that were in the post-war years broken by the American codebreakers and the British codebreakers in US military and naval intelligence and by what became GCHQ. And they revealed the scope and scale of Soviet espionage directed against the Western powers during the war. I think over 200 Americans spied for Stalin during the course of the Second World War. Their identities were not known; they were known by code names. Many of the people who actually spied, their true identities have not been revealed to this day. They're unknown. So some good research projects there using open source intelligence. The tragedy, the real tragedy of the Venona decrypts was, as you said, it was kept secret far longer than it needed to be on any legitimate security grounds. So as this material came online in the late 1940s, early 1950s, sure, we get it. This is top secret, really the apex of the transatlantic intelligence relationship of their products on the Soviet Union. So sources and methods, the two things that intelligence agencies world over care most about, they're not going to go and try to prosecute Soviet agents risking these sources and methods from the Venona decrypts. These decrypts, Venona, revealed the guilt of Soviet agents who, some of them were notorious in the 1950s amid the Red Scare, who were accused of being Soviet spies. And some of these we now know were genuinely Soviet agents, because they're named in the Venona decrypts. Julius Rosenberg, for example. Alger Hiss, for example. Now, the true tragedy of this is that thanks to Stalin's Soviet spies within the US and the UK, he knew about the Venona decrypts. And what's more, the British and the US knew that Stalin knew. So it gets a bit confusing, but the point I'm making is that by a certain point in the early 1950s, and certainly by 1963, when Kim Philby, who had access to the Venona decrypts, when he defected to the Soviet Union, London and Washington knew that this secret was blown. There was no way a damage assessment could say Stalin didn't know about, or Soviet leaders didn't know about this anymore. And in fact, one of the key FBI officers, special agents, working on Venona, who led some of the most significant Cold War spy cases in court, he says to the Robert Lamphere, his name is, he says to the director of NSA, who are you keeping the secret from? It's not from the KGB, it's from the American public. The reality is that if the American public had known about Venona and known about the guilt of some of the most notorious agents identified in the decrypts, I think the public policy understanding of American communism and even broader international relations would have been changed. You mentioned Patrick Moynihan. He was the architect of getting the Venona decrypts revealed, but that wasn't until the 1990s. So this whole period and the amount of the polarization
That's what I wanted you to get to. Since we're suffering from that now so much.
I mean, the polarization that the name Alger Hiss or Julius Rosenberg caused then and still causes now.
People didn't believe the government at all.
No, that's just it.
And of course, McCarthy was making things up. And
McCarthy was making things up, and I think it's fair to say, well, actually, I think it was the Soviet leader Khrushchev himself who said McCarthy was the best agent of influence that the Kremlin ever had. He did more damage than any Soviet actual spy or secret agent did in the US. So it was, in my view, it was precisely that lack of knowledge, that lack of transparency on the part of the US government that allowed a demagogue like McCarthy to arise. And that is, we're talking about applied history, that's one of the clearest. And I've been saying this privately and publicly to the FBI, that on the issue of Chinese espionage today, yes, Chinese espionage, Chinese spies are real. That does not obviously mean that every Asian American is a spy, right? And it is one of the clearest lessons from that 1950s Red Scare is the importance of US agencies, particularly the FBI, being as transparent as possible about the nature of what they know.
But there's a bias toward overclassification somehow.
That's it.
And because it takes more time to know that you declassify. I mean, I don't know.
But yeah, I think that's though again where open source could be the I hope the silver bullet here that allows FBI or whatever agency to get intelligence out without risking sources and methods. That's my understanding of how the US and the UK were able to declassify really in real time the Putin's war plans for Ukraine, if we remember that before his invasion, was because there was so much material available from commercial satellite imagery and so on, that the intelligence communities on both sides of the Atlantic felt confident that they could get what they knew from still higher grade clandestine collection out to the public without jeopardizing sources and methods. And it seems to me that is like a real game changer for where I hope we're going to continue to go with intelligence and national security.
So one more question from me, so everyone should prepare their question. This is kind of builds on what you just said. So the effect of technology on changing our approach to intelligence. You talk about cyber hacking, malware, planting malware. It could be that open source research AI is going to make a difference to that. And deep fakes, I'm interested in this because you can produce evidence. You know, it also, if I was J. Edgar Hoover, it'd be terrible because if I presented a picture of you in a compromising situation, you could produce a picture of me in the same compromising situation, which looks just as authentic. So there's something about that technology, also voice replication. So tell us a little bit about technological change in your field here.
So as with everything that we're living through, I think it's for good and for bad. So taking it on the good, if you like, helping analysts, civil servants who are assessing a threat, AI will be able to process data in a way that the human brain, the human eye just cannot. And I know for a fact that intelligence community on both sides of the Atlantic, again, are working on incorporating AI tools into their analytical tradecraft. So, you know, you're working on this problem set, but an AI tool says, hang on, you haven't considered that data set over there, which has also got some connections. So that is, we hope, going to be a huge benefit for government.
Because one of our problems is bandwidth.
Just absolute huge. That's it.
Attention span is the attention span of high decision makers, but also of the researchers.
That's right. Exactly. And you know, if it can process this and produce it in a succinct bullet point form, a tweet or something, then you know, I'm joking, of course. But so that's a benefit for the analytical component. But then there's this very, very dark flip side, I think, which you're talking about, of the AI generated capabilities for a hostile foreign intelligence service to inculcate, to spread disinformation through deepfakes, and I think that all eyes have got to be on this coming election in this country to see where we go with this. Deepfakes have been talked about for quite some time, but we haven't so far had good examples of where they've had an impact on an election, as so far as I know. But I think it's reasonable to assume that they will play a role in this coming election in the US. There's a whole thorny subject that you just addressed as well about how this is going to impact evidence in courts. And it's at moments like that I guess I'm quite glad to not be practicing as a lawyer anymore. I mean, what an interesting subject for any research projects, for any students here, the use of deep fakes as evidence in court.
And in blackmail, too.
And in blackmail, yeah.
Okay. Yes, we have a microphone. So, Tamsin, first here.
So in 2020, 2021, who was the target on U.S. soil?
Excuse us, we'll come back to you. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I'll hand you the microphone. Thank you. I thought that it was a fantastic book as well. It's incredibly interesting. You pointed out two different eras in which we dropped the ball. When I say we, I'm just going to mean US and UK on Russia. One was during the Soviet era that you talked about, where we refused to spy on them. And the other was during the war on terror. So after 9/11, Putin said, I'm going to open the books to you guys. There are lots of Muslims I'd like to kill as well. And there was an enormous amount of cooperation with the Russians. But the people in the CIA who were Russianists were saying, we know who this guy is. We know who Putin is. This is a really bad idea. And a lot of the cooperation was driven by the private sector, which, Bill Clinton had really created this big push to have the private sector take over a lot of intelligence functions. And some of that, of course, was disastrous, and it created this revolving door between the agencies and the private sector. This is a question I couldn't ask our colleagues the other weekend. I wonder how much of that is going to be a problem with China as well, because we've already seen the big Silicon Valley companies giving very sensitive technologies to China as commercial technologies that they can then re-weaponize. And at national security conferences, you just hear China, 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 and one of the reasons is that that's where all the money is now. Is that something that concerns you, and what do we do about it?
Well, great question. Thank you for the question. I think that, talking to current practitioners and recently retired practitioners on this issue, the issue now is sort of damage limitation of what's already taken place. Yes, ongoing, but really it's figuring out how vulnerable the systems are to a hostile state, be it Russia or China, inside critical infrastructure, inside networks. And they were given access to that because the money was good and we were looking elsewhere. When the history of this period, of the post 9/11 war on terror comes to get written, I've tried my best at the end of the book to write it. The documents are few and far between, so again, it's mostly interviews. But when that history does come to get written, the pendulum swinging so profoundly towards counterterrorism, and what were governments like the US and the UK doing about resurgent great powers like Russia and China? Well, we know for a fact that in 2006, the same year when Putin assassinated Litvinenko on the streets of London, a staggering 95% of MI5's workload was dealing with counterterrorism, 5% left over for all hostile states. So Russia, China, Iran, and so on. I mean, that reveals the extent to which the national security establishment in the UK was completely and utterly overwhelmed with counterterrorism. Again, vested interest perhaps, but also some
just scarce
resources. Now, the similar statistics are not available on the US side, but I'm been reliably told from 3 or 4 people, 4 people who say that they've done similar metrics within the IC, that there is a similar downgrade, the glide down. It's not quite as acute as it is in the UK, but still the pendulum swung so profoundly that resurgent states like Russia and China got low priority. And it is about also the financial services. So Tasman, I'd point you in the direction of the UK Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee report published in July this year into China. It's called the China Report, which is a devastating report on the UK government about exactly the point that you made about looking the wrong direction regarding the national security threats posed by Chinese intelligence, because the revenue streams from Chinese companies in the UK were so profound. The city was making a killing, first with Russia and then increasingly with China.
That's another issue.
Yeah, and the UK government, according to this report, didn't want to rock that boat until it was too late. So it's, I think, an issue of damage limitation at this moment.
Over here, they say that the FBI shifted so many resources toward counterterrorism that they neglected white-collar crime. White-collar crime, not China and Russia, which led to 2008.
Yeah.
That is basically not looking at the corruption in the financial sector. So
Wow, I didn't
that's
know
true,
that.
but it's a,
there's
it's
another
a
parallel.
It's a parallel argument
Yeah,
about
absolutely.
scarce resources.
And then query whether, ladies and gentlemen, whether we're going to, what's the pendulum going to do right now with Israel and Gaza and whatever happens there? Are we seeing, so the pendulum has just begun to move towards hostile states like Russia and China, and then here we are back to counterterrorism again. So where are we right now?
It's a trade-off. It's a risk trade-off.
Yeah.
Matthias.
So traditionally, I think it's fair to say that there are two kinds of tasks, two kinds of reasons why you have intelligence service, like in the UK and in the US. One of them is to ensure that those who make the high-level political decisions are better informed of all the relevant information.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, is you want to have ways of doing things that will ensure that you can't be held accountable for it. So that's the covert action side.
Yes.
It wasn't always the case that the latter part was connected to intelligence at all. So this is, and I wonder, I know about the UK practice, about the American practices, also about Israel, etc. But I think, isn't it the case that the great majority of intelligence services, most countries have intelligence services, are actually focused exclusively on the first part? And do you think that would be a good idea, given all kinds of biases and all kinds of accountability issues, which arise once you allow for the second kind of action as well?
Well, you've just created, I think, a fantastic research project. I actually don't know of a study that has a look globally as to whether covert action is more commonly in a separate agency department than the analytical work. I actually don't know any study that goes through and tabulates it. So that would be a really valuable resource. I think there's, just speaking generally, there's an inherent tension between an agency that is involved in covert action and one that is also analyzing events which that covert action is contributing to. And when there are historically disastrous moments of when one side didn't know what the other side was doing. So it seems to me, the UK example, special forces, so the UK, for example, doesn't have a paramilitary component within its intelligence services like the US does. It has special forces. Yes, MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, does undertake what it calls effect operations. Propaganda, smearing targets, so on like that. You know, the sort of the dirty work that all governments undertake. But it definitely doesn't have a paramilitary function. That's special forces. And the US, the CIA, definitely does have a big paramilitary function. Is the CIA less effective because of it? Historically, we can point to examples of where that would be the case. But I don't have a good answer for you as to whether one model actually, as a tabulated data, is better than the other, as one is more effective. It's a great subject. I wish I had it.
It is a good question.
Yeah.
In the far back?
I just want to, for a minute, step back from the microcosmic view of any particular decade and the success or failure. I wonder if you had, and this may be an overly simplistic question, but I wonder, sir, if you have any perspective or opinion on whether we've gotten our money's worth in the US and the UK, in the broad brush, in the long term, from the existence of these agencies and the way they've functioned. Have they been effective? They've been effective, obviously, in sustaining themselves and growing. Have they been effective, in fact, in adding to the benefit of national security?
No, it's a great question. So I think the way that I would look at this, and I try to emphasize this in the book, is that many of the successes, security intelligence successes in the West, are not obvious to the naked eye, that they are secret or at least less than obvious. So to my mind, at key moments, in the narrative of this book of the 20th century, if you like, we can see where intelligence did contribute directly to international affairs. You mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis. Certainly there was a combination from human intelligence and technical intelligence collection that contributed to JFK's decision-making during the crisis. Okay, so that's one and a very acute example. But I would point in the direction of what happened after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the international arms, nuclear arms limitation and then reduction treaties between East and West, they were actually made possible, expressly codified in the treaties by what was euphemistically known as national technical means. National technical means, NTMs. That was where both the Soviets and the Western powers agreed to allow intelligence collection of their mutual nuclear arsenals. Without that verification process, so that I know that you're actually adhering to the agreement, those agreements would be impossible. This seems to me one of the great unsung heroes or successes of Western and indeed Soviet intelligence during the later Cold War. It helped to stabilize the superpower conflict armed with nukes. Now, I think that there's going to be something, a parallel that will be equally important from national technical means in this new age regarding artificial intelligence. And then the big area that I don't think gets as much attention is bioengineering, biotechnology. So as these new technologies come online, there will be, then will need to be some sort of international regulation about these Pandora's boxes that are being opened up right now. And then there will need to be a verification process that signatories are actually adhering to it. But I don't think it's going to be, so the national technical means was obviously national, meant governments were doing it. And again, it gets back to the thing of private sector, I think will have to be integrated here. So it'll just be technical means. So did we get our money's worth in terms of stabilizing the Cold War after that Armageddon moment? I would say yes, certainly. But then also, yes, of course, huge oversights in terms of long-term strategic failure to analyze long-term strategic threats like a resurgent Russia and China at the expense of immediate priorities. So could be better. If I was grading the UK since 1945, I think I'd probably give the UK a B+. But I'm a mean marker, so.
One of the themes in your book is there's an asymmetry between open societies and closed societies. And you can certainly say that these clandestine services are successful if they steal the bomb, or if the Chinese steal some kind of. So maybe if the Chinese get ahead of us, we can also steal something from them.
From them.
That would be a possibility. But a problem about evaluating the effectiveness of these services is that many of the things they're trying to do is preventive. They're preventive. And evaluating preventive activity is impossible. Because how do you know what would happen if you didn't do anything?
If you hadn't have done that.
And so forth. So there's something really difficult about evaluating. It doesn't mean first of all, we're going to do it. And we can guess that it has some effect, but it's very, very hard. And the policeman who arrests the murderer, then you know he's done something. But if you're preventing a terrorist attack, let's say, how do you know you did?
That's right. I mean, certainly, I helped to write MI5's official history. Took part-time 6 years of my life with Christopher Andrew in Cambridge. And certainly the counter-terrorist threat by the IRA, some of the great successes or effectiveness of British counterterrorism are not in the public domain, about big, significant terrorist attacks that did not take place. So how do you measure that? It's exactly that. I mean, you can say but for, if you like, and analyze it that way.
Great, congratulations on the book, and great seeing you.
It's good to see you.
One of the things you say in the book is that we should be cautious about covert action, and you say that, I'll quote here, you said that outside of the Soviet-Afghan war and perhaps U.S. support for the anti-Soviet solidarity movement, it is difficult to think of a single U.S. covert action that provided a long-term strategic success. And I think that triggers a conversation that is happening between the U.S. and Israel about the use of covert action and non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, in particular in regards to Iran, and Israeli positions that are strong and vocal about the ineffective nature of public diplomacy and the need for assassination of nuclear scientists and Stuxnet activities. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
No, that's quite right. And I hope I phrased that carefully by saying within the narrative of this book, I wasn't saying generally that the covert actions, there are a few and far between that have been successful. But then I would also point to the conclusion of Roland Bergman's book, Rise and Kill First, where he says, yes, Israeli assassination policy can be hugely effective, for immediate threats, a kind of, do you want to use the phrase whack-a-mole, just like literally dealing with one thing after another. But in terms of strategy, and so emphasis on the word strategic, just a policy of assassination is not going to deal with the underlying issue. And that's where I think public open policy diplomacy comes in. I mean, the history of covert action, which we mentioned earlier, is loud and clear, the lesson, which is that a covert action is successful when it operates within the context of broader overt diplomacy or policy, and that just doing things secretly is rarely, if ever, going to produce a sustainable long-term benefit for that country. So, yes, clearly Israel, throughout its history, has conducted remarkably effective discrete operations to deal with counterterrorism and so on, but query whether that's actually a sustainable long-term strategy.
Do you have something to say about the difference between learning capacities of the enemy and learning their intentions?
Yeah.
This is a classic distinction in IR, that if they have, for example, we know that Hamas has these capacities, but we think they're deterred. So then you're learning about their intention. But intentions can change, and how do you know? So there is that's a very important distinction in what you rely upon when you're, and maybe SIGINT is better for just focusing on capacities.
I think that,
That's why SIGINT is preferred.
Yeah.
Because intentions, you hear someone talk, you listen to what
right.
they're saying, they may be giving you disinformation and so on.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with that. I think that generally SIGINT, in generalized terms, is good for capabilities. So we know that this number of tanks, we know that they're operational, we know this amount of aircraft. But you're absolutely right. I think for intents, for aims, what does a leader intend to do? That traditionally is the realm of human intelligence. Sure. Particularly, let's be honest, with someone like Putin, who does not use email, he always does a stage managed thing at the end of his meetings where he picks up the phone or pretends to write something. But we know he doesn't do that. And so having a good agent, human source, close to Putin that can reveal his intentions is absolutely key. And certainly the CIA has been successful with that at key points.
You mean
to answer your question, because I know it looks like your answer, who was the defector? He was a senior officer in the SVR's illegals department who gave important information about the Russian illegals spy ring that was wound up by the FBI and the CIA in 2010. He was then relocated to the US. Putin made no secret of the fact that he wanted to kill him. He said that I'm going to send a Makada, which was a reference to the assassin who killed Trotsky, send an assassin after him. There was always a bright red line that the Kremlin, past and present, would not conduct assassinations on US soil. Europe and Britain, different stories, as we know, but that was always the bright red line. And in this instance, it appears that Putin was willing to cross over that bright red line.
So is the name known?
The name is out there, yeah, absolutely. You can Google it. The name, as far as I'm concerned, isn't actually that important. It's you just say SVR assassination plot 2020. The name isn't that important. I'm much more interested in actually what the Russian government was trying to do.
And what inhibitions they didn't have.
Yep.
Here.
Hi, Professor Walton. I haven't read your book, but I'm really interested in the topic. I wonder about the impact of the deteriorating U.S.-China relationship on spying between these two countries, and also the vice versa, the spying on the relationship. Because now, because of the decoupling that is happening, we see less voluntary information exchange between these two countries. So actually, you will see, in order to maintain the same flow of information exchange, there's a higher demand for involuntary information exchange, which is spying. So the first question is, do you see an uptick in spying between these two countries? And then the second question follows that, if spying is not increased, it's actually make more difficult. And what will be the impact on the relationship? Are we, destined for war? As you keep mentioning, China is a hostile state. So what can we do about this?
So, is increased intelligence collection of benefit to both countries? Theoretically, yes, but it is, as you said at the outset, Stephen, there's an asymmetry here in which it is colossally more difficult for any Western service to collect reliable intelligence on the CCP than it is the other way around. So there's a fundamental asymmetry here. In a perfect world, yes, it would be eyeball to eyeball, and both sides would know what the other's doing. But certainly the CIA suffered from a calamity in 2000. I mean, an absolute disaster in China in 2010. Has the CIA recovered from that capabilities inside China? I don't know, nor should I know. But it seems that it is going to be and will be, continue to be colossally difficult for the US intelligence community to collect reliable intelligence inside China. Is that a way out of, just on the assumption that there is such a thing as the Thucydides trap, is that a potential, is that a way out of it? Yes, and I've been saying to Graham Allison, this is a great article. You could write, intelligence is a way of avoiding the Thucydides trap. Hopefully I'll convince him to get there at some point. But
probably you should write that.
Yeah.
Thank you for a great presentation, and so topical with the 60 Minutes interview last night with the Five Eyes chiefs.
I was just going to mention that as well. Yeah.
I want to pull the thread about the strategic disclosures in and around the invasion of Ukraine, because it seems to me that's a very different function than typically what intelligence services do in terms of finding out plans and intentions and providing information to policymakers. Yeah. What in the realm of the possible does this show? Does this, I think, generally agreed on to be pretty successful campaign of preemptive disclosure of information to the entire world about what these agencies can do that they might not, in a path-dependent sense, already be doing or have done as a matter of history? Yeah,
great question. Thank you. So it's not unprecedented that there's been these efforts for diplomatic intelligence, if you like, or disclosing intelligence at key moments. Cuban Missile Crisis, we remember how JFK authorized the easels of the U-2 photographs at the UN General Assembly. So that was, and he did that basically in real time. There was another moment that didn't go well, though, with Reagan when after the shoot down of the Korean airliners in 1983, he authorized NSA preliminary assessment, but he got ahead of him. The Reagan White House got ahead of itself and then had to claw that back and say, actually, the SIGINT, the underlying SIGINT, wasn't as the confidence in that level wasn't as high as the Reagan White House suggested. So that was an example of getting ahead of ourselves. And then, of course, there's the WMD issue. So What does this show, though? Again, and I've said it several times here, what I think is that what we're living through is just because there's just so much more information out there from other sources that it's going to be just exponentially more easy for governments to get information out to the public. So some scholars have been talking about the democratization of intelligence that we're living through. And I think that the war in Ukraine, the preliminary, those assessments, I feel confident to say we're going to see more of that going forward.
It was a clever thing to do. Did it have any effect on anything?
Well, I think it did. I think that it undermined Putin's so-called false flag
He was going
pretext.
to have a false flag, but
He was going to have a false flag. So
no one really believes those anyway, and so they're kind
I-
of pretending to believe them.
I don't know.
They did invade, after all.
They did invade, so it didn't stop the invasion.
It didn't change the course of the invasion.
I don't know about that. If we've done if there's been a forensic analysis of how his plans changed once his pretexts had been disclosed, and he had to shift formations. That seems entirely plausible to me. That did have an impact. But
I mean, it's a very important thing. Just last on Putin.
Yeah.
You make a big deal about it being a mafia state.
yeah.
Now, mafias don't commit suicide, as far as I know. So does this mean you don't think he's going to drag us into nuclear Armageddon?
That's a good.
If he's an apocalyptic thinker,
Yeah.
then he might. But if he's a mafioso,
Well, he's a mafioso until all the cards are down, and then he becomes something else. Does Putin have any red lines? I don't think so. Would he? He's using the words existential threat a lot, and within Russian military
mafia
doctrine,
people don't talk
no,
about. Okay.
and within Russian military doctrine, existential threat to Russia is the language for nuclear retaliation. So that has been striking that he's been using that really from the outset. But the big question looming in the background is what Xi Jinping would say about that.
Yeah. Well, he's a bluffer. Anyway, join me in thanking our guest. It was great.
Thank you so much. Thank you.